My paper is entitled Poland's Democratic Transition and its Discontents, Political Non-Participation and Populism. And before I give you some of the main ideas from this paper, which is still a work in progress, I have to admit, I wanted to say that where I come from is more of a less of an academic rather than applied research. I actually these days I run a think tank whose aim is to do research in order to give policy advice not only to government but also to civil society groups and other stakeholders. We are a non-partisan organization, but our charter says that our aim is to support Polish modernization reforms and also Polish integration with European Union. So we have very clear aim in the sense we are a pro-European organization. And I think I'm mentioning it because in a way, the way I came to work on the issue of political participation or non-participation was basically the first time around the Polish accession referendum. And this was, interestingly enough, also the time when the issue of political participation, especially defined as electoral turnout in a sort of relatively narrow way, for the first time after the transition of 1989 became a topic of public debate. It became a political issue. And the reason for that was that Polish constitution stipulates that in this case, when we had a referendum on EU accession, the referendum would only be valid if more than 50% of the people turn out. That's the only type of referendum and the only type of provision. We don't have it for national elections, we don't have it for other referenda, but here suddenly the issue of participation understood as election turnout became a topic of public debate, and we became involved in designing a campaign to actually get the vote out, to make people vote. And so this started a lot of research and inquiry into the situation regarding voting turnout and political engagement of citizenry. And I will, in a minute, I will tell you what would be the conclusions, or at least my conclusions from this reflections over now the more than 20 years of Polish sort of democratic disengagement, as I would call it. However, I would say, even though the starting point of this research and this thinking about political participation was quite practical, I think it has quite important theoretical, especially the Polish case, I should say, has quite important and interesting political, theoretical implications. And I would mention the two questions that I think can be generalized if we think about the question of political participation. One is the question that actually you pose in your paper. This is the question of democratic spirit of participation. And so in other ways, is all political participation contributing to better democracy, improvement of democratic standard, or if not, then what are the sort of sets of norms and how can you distinguish this so good and bad participation? And this is the reason why in the title and in my presentation the issue of populism comes up, because I think that populism is a kind of evil twin of political participation. So if we think that civic activity and political engagement is generally something which is necessary for democracy to flourish, then we have to sooner or later confront the issue of populist mobilization, of populist response to sort of discontents of representative democracy, and how these two are related. And of course, there are a number of different questions that can be given to this issue. So I think this is one very interesting general question for which you can find a lot of evidence if you study the sort of Polish history of democracy building from this point of view. The second question, which I think is a more general one than just the Polish case, is the question of all these new sort of postmodern or reflective, we can call it reflective modernity if you like, means of political engagement or civic engagement on more of a grassroots levels, these new modes of participatory democracy, as it is sometimes referred to, and what is their relations to the structures and institutions of representative democracy. This question could be also rephrased as a question of impact, or at least of making connection between activities on, let's call it, sub-political level, for which there is now a lot of research also about the Polish situation, and political change on the, let's say, national level. Political change meaning change in the party power structure, but also policy change. Yes, so I think this is a very, very interesting point of view to look at the sort of relative success of these sort of alternative approaches to political engagement and how it can be measured. I also would say that in terms of sort of more theoretical inspirations for my thinking about political participation, probably the most important work comes from an American sociologist whose name is Jeffrey Goldfarb, and especially his two books, which one was published in 1990s, it's called The Cynical Society, and a more recent work is called The Politics of Small Things. And especially this other book is, I find it useful in the Polish context because it actually tries to look at the connection of this grassroots activity and how sort of people's everyday activity can become political and have political implications and finally bring about political change. And in his book, Goldfarb studies two cases, one of which is actually a starting point for my presentation, which is his study was about Polish democratic opposition and solidarity movement under communism. And his second part, which is a very interesting bridge that he makes, is to anti-war movement in the US, and then in his subsequent piece of work he wrote about Obama campaign. And he tried to use similar analysis whose inspiration actually comes from a short piece written by Václav Havel, which is called The Power of the Powerless. And this piece describes a greengrocer who refuses to display the sign "Workers of the World Unite," and you know the implications of his refusal, and as a you know example of how you can by a small gesture you can actually initiate something which is, first of all, you create a public space and then you use it for democratic purposes. So it's this idea. I think it's very interesting to look from this perspective, especially if you have in mind the success of solidarity movement in Poland in transforming the country from sort of authoritarian socialist or communist, if you like, system into a democracy. because one of the awkward questions about this transformation is what happened to the kind of political participation and political commitment from the times of both the sort of heydays of solidarity movement in 1980-89 and then the sort of opposition activities throughout martial law in Poland, to 1990s, where we finally had democratic system, democratic institutions were created, but suddenly this spirit of civic engagement and participation seems to have disappeared from these institutions. And in fact, if you look at all sorts of data about Poland and Polish political engagement and the sort of state of civic engagement of the society, you will find out that Poland is ranking very low in almost all surveys in Europe in terms of not only turnout, electoral turnout, where we have probably one of the lowest in Europe. We are ranking very low in trust in political institutions, trust in political parties, but also in social trust. So people generally distrust each other, and that has also implications for not only for political engagement but for civic engagement. So, for example, if you had a hypothesis that people are not politically engaged because they move to sort of NGO civil society, it turns out that in the case of Polish, especially early transformation, it's not really the case. I mean, that the statistics of voluntary work, NGO work are also quite low. So you see that something happened in between this movement for democracy and then the actual period of democracy building in Poland, and something that you could try to at least explain. And there has been quite a lot of research about the early transition and the transition in Poland from the point of view of its social consequences. With the well-known division of people who were beneficiaries and winners of the transition. Again, the statistical data was that especially the first years after the transition was the years when the inequality of income has quite rapidly increased. This is, if you look at the Gini coefficient for Poland, the first years of 1990s are quite important. But I would also argue that this kind of socio-economic analysis does not explain everything. If you try to look at this sort of political malaise in Polish democracy. And I think you need to add some more factors. And one of this is a kind of dominance of main political, not only political divisions, but political identities that dominated Polish politics in 1990s and a good part of the 2000s. And this political identity basically meant that or the dominant political division was not between right and left, but between post-solidarity and post-communist political forces. That was the defining cleavage, and you were either on the post-communist, which means that before 1989 you were active in the official state structures and political structures, or you were one of the post-solidarity sort of identity, meaning affinity with democratic opposition and solidarity movement in Poland. And so that was basically how also Polish political history in 1990s was ordered. We had a succession of post-communist and post-solidarity governments, which, however, in terms of practical policy choices, differed very little. And this is also, I think, one of the key reasons why suddenly a large part of the citizenry became politically disengaged, because in many ways Polish political transitions was quite clearly predefined. So we not only had this aspiration to more or less build political institutions as there are in the West, but we had a number of both domestic and international constraints which limited the policy choices that politicians could responsibly make. So we had first, you know, from Council of Europe through IMF, World Bank, and later on in the transition, the dominant force became European Union and the necessity to adopt to EU standards and Copenhagen criteria. And if you look at it from the point of view of the development of democratic institutions, legal rules, and so on, I think you cannot have any doubts that this was good for Polish democracy. That is, we had a very clear blueprint, we built the institutions, and we managed to keep the sort of the continuity between different governments in commitment to these core values. But it also meant that when people were asked to elect the government, they were basically asked to reconfirm the sort of European choice, as it was called at that time, and that there was very little scope for any alternative policy choices, which was especially visible in terms of having something like a modern, not post-communist left, that is the left which would not be rooted in the communist period, and basically there were some weak attempts to create some kind of left-wing political movement which would not have affinity with the post-communist party, which was sort of reinvented itself as social democracy. But these attempts all failed, so we basically were faced with only this one political choice: post-solidarity, post-communist. And also another feature of this landscape or sort of political landscape of 1990s, which determined the attitudes towards politics and towards political engagement, was the fear of populism. But populism was basically defined as anything which would diverge from this transition consensus, as it was called. So basically, anyone who would be critical of any specific reforms would be seen as a populist. And interestingly enough, if you think about this period now and attitudes towards this problem of, which was already visible, of low electoral turnout and other indications like membership of political parties, which were also rather low, even by comparison with other post-communist countries, the dominant interpretation of this was that this was a good thing, because it actually prevented the low engagement. If people were more engaged, it would mean that populists would come and take over and sort of reverse from this transition agenda, and that was the dominant feeling, which, in my view, has actually reinforced this tendency for people to disengage. And last but not least, you talked about this transition from the sort of modern politics with strong political parties and class-based affinities to these most postmodern situation. this, of course, in the case of Poland, we sort of missed the period of sort of pluralistic class-based politics. It was all the class-based politics was in a way compromised as part of the state socialist authoritarian system, where class politics meant basically the dictatorship of the Communist Party, which was called officially dictatorship of the proletariat, but it was of course a dictatorship of party apparatus. And so the transition to democracy was seen also by the younger generation as a kind of liberation from politics. And there was some research we did at the end of 1990s with focus groups comparing attitudes of sort of older generation, which was active during the communist times, and the younger generation, which already grew up in democracy. And in one piece of this research was quite, I think, telling, and it sort of also relates to our discussion about cars yesterday and cars as social signifiers, because in those focus groups, people were asked to choose photos of cars and say which car when they think about a person who votes and person who doesn't vote. So what car would you sort of choose as an emblem of these two persons? It was kind of projection exercise. And it turned out that in this group of young people, the person who votes was symbolized by cars which were produced during the socialist period, like Trabant, Wartburg, whereas the person who doesn't vote would drive a Porsche, a fancy sports car, enjoying the freedom and sort of also probably the new consumerist opportunities that capitalism brought. So you had I think at least 2 or 3 good reasons for political disengagement, which was not seen as a problem until or not defined as a problem until the referendum. And during the referendum was the first time when we had an experience, not only which we had a practical political problem of actually mobilizing voters, and we did there were at least 2 conflicting claims about this idea that there should be some kind of pro-voter campaign. One claim would be that if we have this pro-voter campaign, we will sort of awake the Eurosceptics who will go to vote and reject the accession. The other claim, which we try to prove with the research we did in the institute, was that in fact most of the pro-EU voters are taking the results of the referendum as a foregone conclusions. So they are the ones who would stay at home, and we need to have a campaign in order to actually make them aware that this is an important issue and their activity is, at least at this point in time, required. And there were a number of I think quite interesting policies that we developed. One was a very simple policy of extending the time of voting, which was based again on the research showing that people, normally it was summer and people will be out of towns for this time of the year because of the change of lifestyle. And I think also from as a sociologist, this was, or political scientist, it was the first time when the issue of changing lifestyles in Poland and changing modes of political engagement was started to be researched, and it was feeding directly into this debate about political engagement. Another idea that we tested then with some success was that public media made available broadcast time to NGOs, which could produced their own material advocating either for or against the accession. And this was the idea of sort of broadening the scope of discussion and getting people actually interested, even if it meant that more people would vote against the EU. And the result was a success. There was a 58% turnout, which is well above the average of the two other national referenda which we had, which neither of them managed to meet the 50% threshold. And this was for the first time that we used the sort of get out the vote campaign and sort of tested it in real life with some results. So that was one, I think, of the sort of turning point and the discussion of thinking about political participation on this mega level, on macro level, understood as participation in voting. The other interesting case which I would highlight was 4 years later, in 2007, we had, maybe I should start a bit earlier, this populist backlash, which was sort of expected throughout the transition as a backlash against EU, ironically happened in Poland 3 years after 2 years after the referendum, or 1 year after EU accession. And what was interesting in it from the point of view of someone thinking about the issue of civic engagement and populism was that the elections which brought to power three populist parties, and I will explain in a minute what I mean by them being populist, were also the elections with the lowest ever turnout in the history of Polish political elections. That is, the turnout was only 40%. So in fact, the winning party, the one who got to form the government, which got 25% of the vote, which meant that 1 in 10 persons voted for that party. And by forming coalition with two other parties, they managed to create a government which officially announced that they are breaking with the past and introduced a number of policies which for most people sort of liberal establishment saw as a threat to the democratic standards which were developed during the EU accession period. And the key idea why this would be this case can be described as a populist government was that its program was not so much to change the policies of previous government as it was to replace the old political elite, be it post-solidarity or post-communist, with the new political elite, and that there were basically three sort of programmatic items on their agenda. So one was to finish the democratic revolution by decommunization, so getting rid from public life of all the people who were in some way involved in public life before 1989. The second and the most popular cause was to end with corruption, and corruption was at the time perceived as the most important problem next to unemployment. And the third element had to do with kind of identity politics, which is to impose, to create a moral revolution based on Catholic values and the sort of Polish national Catholic identity. And the key thing about, what it tells you, I think, about the issue of political participation versus populism is that there are two things, that populism doesn't necessarily need mass appeal. In fact, this was very clearly government formed by parties which had very strong but minority support from very determined and organized groups who supported it. And secondly, populism was, unlike we thought in 1990s, populism was not based on a threat to the dominant political change. In fact, this government hired as a finance minister a very hardline monetarist, neoliberal economist in a way, so you didn't see almost any way of addressing these social issues which came up during the first and were one of the causes of dissatisfaction with the state of democracy. But instead they applied what is now being called in Eastern European context selective justice. That is, they used the beefed up anti-corruption institutions to actually go after their political opponents. This government was in power only for 2 years, and it broke down when the prime minister tried to arrest deputy prime minister for corruption, and the coalition broke down. But what was interesting is that these 2 years between 2005 and 2007 were the years of increased civic activity in Poland, and suddenly this populist government galvanized many social groups, such as students, intellectuals, also some of the trade unions, to get involved not only in social protests, so protests about things like wages and so on, but in more directly political protests. So, for example, there was this very nationalistic education minister who tried to sort of review the school curriculum from this point of view, and there were protests of students and pupils on the street against the policies. This was really something that happened for the first time in the history of Polish democracy. And the culmination of this wave of protests were early elections in 2007, when suddenly there was an upsurge in voting turnout. 54% by standards of Polish parliamentary elections is really was a big change, and the government was basically removed from office by this popular mobilization, which also included a Get Out the Vote campaign. There was a very popular slogan developed by a coalition of actually NGOs and some people from advertising agencies which work with NGOs to design this Get Out the Vote campaign. It was not a campaign against this government, but it was just a campaign to mobilize the citizens to get interested, and its slogan was go vote and change the country, basically. And what is interesting from this point of view of sort of normative background is also, if you compare public aptitudes to democracy as such, between 2005 and 2007, you will see that approval for democracy as the best system of government between those 2 years jumped from 50% to more than 70%. So in a way, this experience of civic engagement also improved people's belief in democracy as an active, as the best possible system, so the belief in democracy. So now, since the time is running out, I will only say that these elections were crucial for Poland in the sense that they completely realigned the political scene and created a new set of political identities, which are also changing the political landscape in Poland, and they are changing it from grassroots level towards the national level. And there are three areas in which this change can be already discernible. One is the women's movement, which was marginalized throughout the transition as something irrelevant for the modernization challenges, and which sort of reconstituted itself as creating one very, very broad women's lobby, lobbying for a number of causes, but first of all, the main political objective was to improve women's representation in politics through introducing of parity system in elections, and that was partly successful. We have now quotas, not parities, not 50%, but in a way, for a movement which is only 2 years old, they managed to. What basically happened was mainstreaming of gender issues and the issue of women's participation in public life from sort of marginal of politics towards the political mainstream. I think this is one of the transformation of Polish politics, which will have a very long-term repercussions. And also the first time when the issue of political participation was not also looked upon from the point of view of election turnout, but also of the representation itself, in this case of women representation. The second interesting group that is clearly changing its attitudes are young people, and here in a way you see probably convergence with the models that are described as the changing attitudes of politics in West European countries. So on the face of it, unlike with the women's movement, the youth remains apolitical in the sense of low electoral turnout, continuing low electoral turnout. And the research which we did about their attitudes was basically the question of lack of relevance of the politics as it is done in Poland for what they perceive as important issues. But it turned out that there is a lot of sort of sub-political activity going on, especially with internet, the new media. And we also had one very, I think, interesting case of protests against the ACTA agreement. I don't know if you know what it is, the agreement which would give big powers to prosecute piracy, or what is defined piracy in the internet. And again, it was quite of a surprise for all the observers of the political scene that this apathetic youth suddenly came, not only it started as an internet protest, but it became a street protest. And in fact, speaking of impact of political movements, the impact was fantastic. That is, they actually forced the government to withdraw from the ratification of the treaty. And Polish members of parliament, one after one, of European Parliament, were announcing one after one that they will vote against the treaty in the European Parliament, which actually rejected the treaty. And it also shows that the issue of relevance of political agenda is there. However, there are two, and this is really the last words, there are two problems with this new sort of more hopeful political landscape. One problem is that these initiatives which had successes in changing specific policy, still failed to to be more permanently connected to the political scene. So the political scene in Poland is still dominated by a moderate right-wing party and this populist right-wing party, which is something similar as if in Britain you would have David Cameron's Conservatives and UKIP as the two political choices. That's more or less how the political scene looks like. And with all this sort of progressive civic and political engagement on different levels, basically they didn't have that much impact on how the this political representation is organized. That is, there is a problem with political representation. And the second problem is the fact that there is a visibly increased political mobilization on the right, including the far right. So it's now not only populism, but also something which I would call right-wing extremism, advocating political violence, which uses some of the tactics that these left-wing groups use. For example, there are groups of right-wing thugs who come to lectures of liberal professors and disrupt lectures at universities, and they are creating what is called the flash mobs, yes, using internet and social media to show up at this lecture and make sure it doesn't happen. And these organizing tools that have become available have also been instrumental in developing much more robust extreme right agenda in Poland. So this is more or less where I think we still need more research to understand how this right-wing political scene works and that this is organized and how it can actually be. It's dangerous. I think it's not going away, but at least if the method of this anti-populist mobilization, which were tried and used before, can work in this respect, and I think again the attitudes of this group of young citizens will be quite crucial. So I think. What is most important from this Polish experience for me is that the sense that low civic participation is conducive to and helpful for developing of extreme right-wing politics rather than the other way around. So we need political engagement. If not to affect positive political change, but also to counter these threats. So, thank you.